Because you've always taken such charge.
You are listening to The Border Chronicle.
Since 2018, the nonprofit America's Voice, an immigrant advocacy organization, has been tracking anti-immigrant messaging in political campaigns. Zachary Mueller, political director for the organization, talks about how the messaging has changed since the Trump era and how white nationalism has been embraced by mainstream Republicans in their campaigns leading up to November's midterm election. Mueller also talks about how Democrats are tailoring their messages around the border, or in many cases not talking about the border at all. And he has some examples of political candidates who are doing it right. There needs to be more speaking out and challenging of the narratives, he says.
I think not just on why the invasion is so dangerous and pushing back on that, but I think also challenging that somehow fentanyl is an immigration issue in any which way whatsoever, when it's not.
Well, thank you so much, Zachary, for joining us on the Border Chronicle. I'm hoping that you could start talking about, I guess, America's Voice has been tracking nativist and anti-immigrant campaign messaging for the last few years. If you could talk about that project and why you all started it.
Yeah, so just to kind of give a bit of a background. So we started in 2018 looking around, seeing a bunch of anti-immigrant ads from Republican candidates across the spectrum and seeing, hey, is anybody kind of tracking this? Didn't really see a whole lot of that. And so we said, okay, well, we're going to start tracking that. So really, we started this in September of 2018, really trying to see, what is Republicans across the board saying in their political advertisements around anti-immigrant messaging, other nativist messaging there? What are they saying? And kind of like, what's the coordination there? What are the main themes? So we've been tracking that since 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and up until this year. So we track Facebook ads, we track kind of the daily Twitter activity of candidates, but also obviously their TV ads and their campaign emails as well. So really any of their kind of public-facing political communications, we're tracking that from Republicans across the country and looking to identify any forms of racist or xenophobic dog whistles. And then we put those in a public-facing database for folks to take a look to see if there are candidates in your area that are using these forms of strategic racism. And so just briefly, what we found already this year is as we head into the general election, we've already identified 4,000 different pieces of political messaging that are using racist or xenophobic dog whistles, and over 2,000 different unique ads that are employing kind of a nativist border narrative from Republicans. So a huge swath of that already this year before we even get into like the heavy political spend season as we head into the general election.
Yeah, and how does that messaging break down? I know you have different categories like Great Replacement, Invasion, Border Crisis. Can you talk about the different categories that you've seen?
Yeah, so really what we've identified really is three main areas, three main buckets or themes for Republicans going into this election cycle for the general election. So the first one is really about open borders. Then we see something about fentanyl, or making this kind of spurious connection between illicit drugs and asylum seekers, and then around invasion and replacement theory. None of this is actually based on any real material fact at all. So, the borders are not open, nor do Democrats or the White House support such a policy. The illicit drugs that come into the country come in through the ports of entry, not through asylum seekers, not through migrants, but through an international criminal syndicate, right, that comes through trucks and cars and other ways. And so it's really not an immigration issue whatsoever. One we're deeply concerned about is this language of invasion or replacement, which is tied to the Great Replacement theory. And folks might remember that from it kind of busting into the mainstream with the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, where an eclectic group of bigots were marching in the street chanting, "You will not replace us, Jews will not replace us," this kind of anti-Semitic, nativist, really racist white nationalist conspiracy theory that has now shown up and been adopted by Republican Party candidates who are using that same language in their ads. One, it's not true, and two, it's deeply, deeply dangerous to kind of echo this kind of white nationalist conspiracy theory that has a direct tie to domestic terrorists and dozens of murders of our fellow Americans.
And this great replacement theory, invasion messaging, when did that sort of take hold? And is it a nationwide thing, or is it mostly prevalent in certain states?
Yeah, I wish I could say it was just a few bad apples or a few members of Congress, right? But unfortunately, what we've seen this year is a real adoption from the Republican Party, from the leadership on down, adopting this sort of language. So take us back to kind of a little bit how we got here. I mentioned the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017. And that was really a horrific event that culminated in the murder of an anti-racist activist. Now, the Republican Party and Donald Trump, who were in office at the time, had an opportunity to denounce clearly and forcefully the white nationalism, the neo-Nazis, the rank bigotry that was on display there. But they chose to do the opposite. Infamously now, right, we remember that Donald Trump said, well, there's good people on both sides. And the Republican Party, the other areas of leadership, just refused to push back in any real significant way on the Trump administration on that, really kind of legitimizing it. So we start to see that a little bit more in 2018 when there was more heated rhetoric around anti-immigrant themes in the election cycle. We saw another horrific mass shooting in Pittsburgh where the white nationalist terrorist there used language saying that he was trying to stop a migrant invasion before he went and murdered 11 people. In between that, and then a horrific attack in El Paso, Texas, where 23 people were murdered, where the white nationalist there said he was going to murder people trying to stop the invasion. Donald Trump's campaign ran over 2,000 Facebook ads that use that invasion language in between those two mass killings. Then kind of fast forward, over the summer of last year, Rep. Jody Arrington, congressman from Texas, put forward this messaging bill, really trying to take this idea of invasion, this conspiracy theory, and say it actually was real, and trying to give states the authority to declare war independently as an individual state, to use military force to forcibly remove asylum seekers, migrants, and refugees. After he kind of put that messaging bill forward, I recently looked, there's over 60 co-sponsors of Republicans signing on to that bill that are legitimizing and normalizing that racist conspiracy theory. But you also have people like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio. So leaders in the Republican Party, former presidential candidates, members that used to were a part of the Gang of Eight was pushing forward for immigration reform, are now using that same white nationalist deadly rhetoric of invasion in their campaign messaging. But also you have leaders like Elise Stefanik, who is the third ranking House Republican, who ran replacement theory ads on Facebook and then got a lot of really important pushback after the deadly attacks in Buffalo, her home state, for her ads. She doubled down. That very next day, she sent out a fundraising email to her supporters trying to raise money that's saying that she was the victim, she was the one being attacked for echoing that exact same language as the Buffalo shooter. And so I think when the leadership of the party really engages in this activity, then members all the way down to the local level feel like it's okay that they're going to go ahead and engage in that activity as well. And we've seen over 600 different pieces of political messaging in this cycle from candidates across the country, from Wyoming to Maine to, Minnesota, but also on the border as well in Texas and Arizona, using this kind of rhetoric. And really what we've seen actually is in Texas and Arizona, very particularly, the Republicans there have really embraced this rhetoric as part of their campaigns, especially the candidacy of Carrie Lake, who is running for governor of Arizona, has made invasion and this kind of white nationalist conspiracy theory a cornerstone of her election campaign.
How does this play in elections? Do these candidates win using this type of rhetoric?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question to ask, right? Like, is this effective? Now, I think there has been some recent polling, one from NPR and Ipsos that came out last month that was really kind of, and there's been other polling as well that's kind of indicated that there is a real belief amongst some segment of the American population believing in this white nationalist conspiracy theory. But just because they believe it doesn't actually make it true, but they think there is a real segment of the population. We can pretty accurately say that at least 30% of the American people believe some version of this replacement and invasion theory. And a majority of Republicans that are believing this racist lie as well. Now, we should, I think, really think about this as a concerning red flag that says that as Republicans and people in power invest millions of dollars in putting forward this racist lie, well, of course, people are going to believe it. There is a reason why Coca-Cola invests millions of dollars in their advertising campaigns every year, right? Is that advertising over and over puts it at the forefront of people's brains. Now, that said, recent evidence shows that this probably is not the most effective general election strategy. Is it maybe a way that they can win through a primary debate where they're trying to out-nativist the other candidate for a very small and shrinking radicalized MAGA base? Maybe, but it can backfire. We've seen that in actually 2017 in Virginia, where Republican gubernatorial candidate in Virginia in 2017 ran hard on anti-immigrant rhetoric, fear-mongering there. Steve Bannon, President Trump's former senior official, claimed that rhetoric was actually going to help him win the election cycle, but it didn't. He lost. We also saw that in 2018 when from 2016 to 2018, there was 5 times as much spending on anti-immigrant ads, and that was overwhelmingly from Republicans. And we saw in that election that there was historic wins for Democrats. So clearly it was not effective for them there in 2018. We also can look at 2019 in Kentucky and Louisiana, where the gubernatorial candidates there ran hard on anti-immigrant rhetoric. They both lost in red states. And so I think what we can look like heading into this election is that Republicans are going to continue to escalate their sort of extremism, embracing this white nationalist conspiracy theories. And I think we can see early in some of the polling in Arizona that that's not really working. I mean, Mark Kelly has a sizable lead in the polls, but I think we will see on election day whether, again, the multiracial majority turn out to reject this sort of extremism from Republicans.
Yeah, and I interviewed you recently for an article for the Border Chronicle. One thing I'm really interested is I've noticed a lot of the candidates who run on this invasion rhetoric also run on election denialism, that the 2020 election was stolen by Democrats. Mm-hmm. So they sort of pair these twin narratives together. And you had brought up an ad by Blake Masters, who's running for U.S. Senate in Arizona, backed by Peter Thiel, who's, a tech billionaire, tons of money. And it's a particularly noxious campaign ad, which I was hoping you could talk about how he sort of joined those two ideas of the invasion rhetoric with the election denialism, and how that kind of works to undermine democracy.
Yeah, so this ad comes from Blake Masters' primary campaign. He has since tried to pull that down, right, trying to hide it, from general election voters. I think is a little bit of maybe some subjective evidence to what you were asking about before. But in this ad really is a version of the replacement theory that is pretty clear. So first, he opens up the ad having clips from Tucker Carlson. This is after Tucker Carlson was being, put in the press about his incessant use on the great replacement theory. Tucker Carlson even recently has argued very forcefully that he believes in the great replacement theory and that he thinks that is a real thing. So Blake Masters, it's an initial red flag of how he's signaling to voters. But in that ad as well, he articulates this idea, this false fiction, that there is somehow 20 million illegal immigrants that have been imported into United States. Now, he uses this language of importation or being imported to kind of signal to this great replacement theory, this kind of false fiction, which is that somehow there's a plot from Democrats, the elites, to move folks into the United States. Not somehow the reality of the case, which is that there's forced global migration, people fleeing for their lives. And at the very end of the ad, right, he uses this language of invasion again, saying that there's an invasion of migrants here. And the subtext for that is not subtle, right? Is that there's an invasion of non-white migrants to come and replace the voting population of white voters. And I think the language of invasion is dangerous for a number of reasons. One, it's dangerous, as we've talked about courting more racist political violence, as we've already seen. But I think there's more of a longer term. When Blake Masters says that there's 20 million illegal immigrants, which is a wild exaggeration, entering the country to vote, he's setting up the pretext that if he loses, well, he can then say, well, this is the invasion of these immigrants that came in, that the Democrats brought in this invasion. Well, that's the reason why I lost this election. And for a long time, even going back to Donald Trump when he, lost the popular vote in 2016, said it was a bunch of illegal immigrants voting, when there is no evidence of the case that undocumented immigrants vote in any way in elections. But this kind of narrative that they're building really helps lay that groundwork for their supporters to say, if you believe conspiracy A, well, here now it supports conspiracy B. It is really concerning that this is being put on television, backed by a good amount of money.
Yeah, I mean, after he talks about the 20 million coming across, he shows these clips of Biden and Kamala Harris saying, "We did it, Joe," on her cell phone, And I think there's a picture of Nancy Pelosi also or something like that. So what's the Democrats' messaging like around the border? Are they pushing back against this invasion and replacement rhetoric, or how are they doing campaign messaging wise?
Yeah, I would always want more. I think it's an extremely dangerous and urgent situation that we find ourselves in when one of the major of the two political parties is investing so heavily in such a dangerous white nationalist conspiracy theory. I think the moment calls upon Democrats to match that and to provide facts and also a different narrative for people to hear. That being said, I think there are a few examples of Democrats doing well and messaging in powerful ways in this election cycle. So I think, if other Democrats are looking for how to do this, but other organizations are looking for models to lift up, I think Veronica Escobar, the congresswoman who represents El Paso, has a number of really powerful articulations of where she is talking about the real danger and the real threat of these conspiracy theories and how that's affected her own constituents. Now, she is not in a difficult race, but I think she has been a prominent champion and someone to look to say, here is how to do this well. Also looking at Texas, I think Beto O'Rourke, who's running for governor in that race, has had a number of examples where he has modeled a good behavior on how to talk about this. So he, in a number of town halls over the summer, has named very explicitly that his opponent, Greg Abbott, has engaged in this invasion rhetoric that led to 23 of his fellow Texans being murdered in El Paso. But then also talking about the need for real reforms that lead with our values, that talks about having a humane and safe border. And I think really trying to talk about both what Republicans are doing, but also articulating that there does need to be real solutions here. And we need to talk about those real solutions. And then I think, we've seen in Arizona, Mark Kelly, a more of a moderate candidate who is trying to do a kind of a both and strategy, where he will talk about the need for improved ports of entry, both for the economy and also for the folks coming into the United States. But then also talking about the need for support for dreamers, pathway citizenship, and voting the right way on difficult votes. So I think there's some Democrats in Florida as well that are kind of leading the charge about leaning into this moment and championing for reforms. But I would be remiss and I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say that there could be a lot more that needs to be done.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because you mentioned Senator Kelly, who's the incumbent running against Blake Masters, and of course he's supporting Title 42, and really Title 42 has led to a lot of increased deaths and a higher number of repeat crossers. It's not an immigration solution. It's really making things worse, actually. So it's disappointing to see that. But at the same time, they're not, stoking racial violence and, mass shootings.
Yeah, and it seems like a really low bar to be able to clear, to say, don't stoke mass shootings and don't demonize immigrant communities. But I think we have to be honest as well that wasn't always the case for the Democratic Party. It wasn't too long ago that Democratic candidates, 2018, were running ads with the Border Patrol Union in their ads. And we're not seeing that this cycle. And I think, for communities that care about having pro-immigrant policies, creating a pro-immigrant country, creating policies that allow us to get to the place where we can have the reforms necessary to find a pathway to citizenship for our 11 million undocumented neighbors. I do think as much as there is more yet to go, I do think we should also acknowledge that we have won a lot on the values, the messaging, the kind of sentiment, both I think inside the Democratic Party and also the country writ large, that the majority is with us on these issues. They support immigration, they support immigrants, they support asylum policies. They want to be a welcoming nation. And so I think, we should have the confidence to say that we are part of that majority. I think Democrats should have that confidence as well. Unfortunately, we see the kind of vitriol and a loud speaking from Republicans. But I just kind of want to note that, I think we have to hold those things both in our heads at the same time.
Right. And also you mentioned the money. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars invested in this anti-immigrant campaign messaging, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Democrats are talking about different stuff entirely. They're not really talking about the border that much. So you've got this, it's like a David versus Goliath thing where this really extreme messaging about the border is basically so dominant now. There's just not that much investment on the other side to push back against it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm indicating, right, about there needs to be more speaking out, more challenging of the narratives, right? When Republicans have the space to themselves, well, it's not surprising that more Americans start to believe that disinformation when they're not hearing a different narrative. And I think there is a real tension, right? And I think we should also, know that when you look at public opinion polling for Democrats, independents, immigration is not a top issue for voters as they're going to the polls. Now, it is an important issue for an important segment of the Democratic coalition, and Democrats need to speak to them and need to speak to these issues, and they need to not cede ground. Because if they're going to win the debate, they first have to engage that debate. And I think that we have to, as an advocate, right, somebody who's fighting for immigration reform on a daily basis, I'm trying to keep those in my mind as well too, that knowing that like we want them to speak out more and we want them to speak out forcefully, but also knowing that there's also lots of other priorities that they need to speak about at this moment, because we're facing a wave of extremism from Republicans. And I think it would be helpful, not only for Democrats, but other organizations to engage and say, look, their extremism on immigration, their extremism on how to have a policies of cruelty and chaos at the border is part of their larger sorts of extremism on abortion, on guns, on anti-democratic attacks. And I think we kind of fit in part of that larger conversation. And, hopefully we'll be able to be in a position to kind of push for reforms outside of the general election here coming as well.
Yeah, and so the Republican Party has invested, millions and millions in their messaging around the border. Are they offering any type of solution other than fear mongering? Do they have any types of plans that they're offering to fix things?
Yeah, it's a great question. The short answer is no, because what's in these ads, right, is a sort of strategic racism. And what I mean by that is consciously invoking racist ideas through coded words and language and imagery to invoke racist fears and anxieties in voters, and doing that intentionally. But what they're not offering, right, like what you're saying, right, is any real solutions to how to address issues of global migration. I mean, climate change is going to make that a fact of the world, regardless of what the politics are. And so, we can, as the United States, be able to manage that process in a fair, safe, and humane way. But that's not what Republicans are interested in talking about. When they're talking about immigration in their ads, or they're talking about migrants more generally, or open borders, it isn't actually to talk about the issue of immigration whatsoever. It's a way to talk about identity. It's a way to talk about fears over safety, over benefits, and racialize those ideas, not have a real conversation about fixing or having real policy solutions. Now, when pressed to put forward policy solutions, all they say is, we need to go back to the Trump administration. We need to go and build a wasteful wall, spend $15 billion on a wall that can be cut down with a $15 saw. Or, they want to talk about their kind of cruelty and chaos agenda, which was allow no asylum seekers in, separate families, put children in cages, right? Create conditions that are deeply disturbing and dehumanizing and really cause real harm to migrants seeking asylum at our borders. And what they hope for is that they can actually remove asylum altogether. Make sure that asylum is no longer the established law that has been for decades in this country, where folks fleeing violence, fleeing for their lives, are able to come to the United States and be a part of that American dream. And that's really the solutions that they have, are closing the borders, sealing them off completely, which I don't think is actually a real solution, nor is it tenable with the American people.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, a lot of Trump's policies are still in place, like Title 42 anyway. And none of that is solving anything. It's just making things worse, basically.
Yeah, and it's like, well, what's the alternative, right? Is that we could have a safe, humane, and fair system, or we could do what Republicans want to do and try to somehow continue and to double down on failed policies. A deterrence only policy has not worked, nor will that stop migration. It just won't. We've tested that. We know it. We know that to be the case, right? So we can continue to try that failed strategy, or try to create a pathway to citizenship for our 11 million undocumented neighbors. Or, as Republicans suggest, we can strip and dismantle the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the DACA program for Dreamers, and start a program of mass deportation, which will not only separate families, tear apart communities, and be horribly devastating for all of those who either are family or friends from those communities, but also just like deeply devastating to the American economy. And so, like, regardless of how you feel about some of these issues, I think, if you pull away just even the slight veneer of what Republicans are putting forward, you realize that it would be laughable if it wasn't so cruel and dehumanizing their kind of complete lack of any real policy solution on this issue.
Yeah. So what can people do to sort of push back against this really corrosive rhetoric? What can people do?
Yeah, so I think there is a role for media, and I think for regular people. You are the readers and consumers of media, right? And so if you're seeing misinformation in that where media is replicating false GOP talking points, right? Write a letter to the editor, like correcting that information. We at America's Voice have lots of fact sheets to kind of back that up. And I think for reporters themselves, right, like holding Republicans accountable, that you're spending $1 million in ads talking about an open border or fentanyl and invasion, and none of that's actually true, and trying to hold them accountable. And I think that kind of goes to the second bucket here is for regular voters, is that whether you can vote or not, you're a part of your community. And I think, it isn't just saying go out and vote harder in this election, right, to be able to win. But I think, voting is a thing we do on one day of the year. But there's a real important part of like organizing in your communities, communicating to your neighbors, your families and friends, not only about the things that you stand for, but also about the real threats that are faced upon our communities. This invasion rhetoric, this replacement theory rhetoric, and the rhetoric coming from Republicans is putting a target on the backs of our fellow Americans because of the color of their skin or the accent that they speak with. And that's a real threat. And I think we need to make sure that we are organizing our communities, we are voting if that's possible, if not, helping other folks get to the polls to vote, because that's the real challenge here. And whether or not it is your elected member, because there are the Paul Gosars in Arizona, which is in a safely red district, which is going to be really, really difficult to get him out of office. Now, if you're in those districts, you should definitely go out and you should be a part of the electoral process as well. Don't sit it out just because of that is the case. But there are other candidates, take Juan Ciscomani, who is a Republican running in Arizona. He's in a battleground race. And the very first vote that any member of Congress takes is for Speaker of the House. And he has, taken money from Elise Stefanik, who has run replacement theory ads. He has not said that he will not vote for Kevin McCarthy for Speaker if they win House, even though Kevin McCarthy says he's going to bring Paul Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene into committee hearings. And I think there are some real efforts to say, look, you're going to vote to empower this sort of extremism. And I think there are real opportunities in real races here for voters and regular folks to organize, to hold elected leaders accountable. If you are talking to a Democratic candidate, right, or you want to write to them as well too, ask them to speak out. Make sure that they know how important it is to you and your community that elected leaders, no matter what side of the party line they are forcefully speaking out and denouncing white supremacy. Because I think evidence in academia shows that when elected leaders denounce and give no quarter to racist conspiracy theories, that actually helps reduce the likelihood of these violent attacks. But I think it's also important that elected leaders do that if we're actually going to fulfill the American promise of a multiracial democracy. So again, I think there's work for regular folks to do to talk to reporters, to push on Republican candidates, and also to push on Democratic candidates here in these next several months to let folks know like how important and how serious this is, not only just to ourselves, but to the future of our country.
The Border Chronicle is reported by Todd Miller and Melissa Del Bosque, based in Tucson, Arizona. This interview was edited by me, Lily Clark. If you like what you're hearing, please consider rating us on your favorite podcast platform. It'll help other people find the show. You can read and listen to more local border reporting on our website, theborderchronicle.com.